These will work. We're going to turn to the amazing book of Hebrews this morning. Chapter 11. This is page 1209 if you're making use of one of these Red Church Bibles that you're free to take, as always, to your homes. Book of Hebrews, chapter 11. Let me just explain to you what it is that we're going to be doing on these Sundays. And some of you will be fairly new here in the church this morning. You will have maybe missed what it was that we were saying right at the very start of all of this. And so let me explain to you. Here in our Bibles are 10 different snapshots of what it will mean if you will live by faith. What we could refer to as 10 believers. We've got 10 worshippers, 10 ordinary Jews. So they did not come out the womb with halos and so on, no sin in their lives. No, we can all be clear that they were serial strugglers with sin like you, and they all had their issues like us all in this room. But they are pulled then from the hordes that we have in our Bibles, and they are all here for one reason. They all lived with faith. And now this God wants that same faith in you. So let me put it to you in this kind of sense as we start this morning, and I think this will set this up for us in a really helpful way. I want you to understand that your company matters. The guys that you hang with, the ones that you share with, the ones that you listen to, the ones that you will turn to for a pep talk, social media influencers, and that is a good name. And what is obvious is that we become who they are. For we all have got models, we've all got heroes, no one's an island, not even one of us here in this room. And gradually all of that influence comes home to roost in our lives. So there is the influence of culture. There is the influence of fashion. There is the influence of trends and friends and adverts and all of that stuff, even the DJ that you listen to in the car in the morning. And then all of the folks who have raised you, and that's a really scary thought for us as parents. And here's a God who clearly gets all of that, and so he puts before you 10 lives. Now, here's what they did, he says. Here's how they lived. Here is what they left. Here are the ways that they trusted in me. And he lists them here. He holds them up for all of us as Christians. Receive, he says, their influence on you. We come this morning to snapshot number 2. You will see from verse 5, this is the life of Enoch. Let's read from the start as we hear now the word of this God. Now, faith is, and then we get that Greek word hypostasis. We've explored what this means. It's my confidence, isn't it? It's my basement, my ground floor. It's my everything. It's my rock that is right there under the whole of my life in this world. That's what that means. And we all have seen this, that the word hypo, it means under, and the word stasis is standing. And so when you pull those two things together, you say to yourself, faith is what is under me, and it is on that I stand. And so I just remind all of us this morning, and it's good to relearn this every Sunday, so we come back to our roots. And so I just remind all of us all over again that if you have come to Jesus as Savior in repentance of sins, and you want Him alone to be your Lord, then that faith is not secondary to anything in your life. It's not secondary to your sports teams. It's not even secondary to your love life. Nor is it sitting on the very fringes of your life, but rather, says this man, here's the ground floor. This is the place where I stand. And so faith is that. It's that confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. Now this, he says, is what the ancients were commended for. And by faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. And by faith Abel from last week brought God a better offering than Cain did. And by faith he was commended as righteous when God spoke well of his offerings. And by faith Abel still speaks even though he is dead. And now here this morning is our text. By faith Enoch was taken from this life so that he did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away. For before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. And without faith, it's impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. Now let me just read to you the really short story of this man. Sometimes you reach for a biography on a shelf and it comes down in 2 volumes and hundreds of pages. But here is this life in only a few lines. If you wish to go there, it's in Genesis 5. Genesis 5, where we now read these words, that this is the written account of Adam's family line. And then what follows here is the record, or what we could call the census, of the 10 generations between the fall and the flood. Right? And Enoch is the 7th in that line. Adam is obviously sitting there at the start. Noah is all the way down at the end. And then we have Seth in the middle, and Enosh and Kenan, and there are others. And you will note in this story that the whole world is changing because something is happening that is awful. It's called death. And then he died, verse 5. And then he died in verse 8. And then he died, verse 11. And then he died, verse 14. And 9 times in this passage, that is the same phrase that is always the record of every one of these lives. And then suddenly, verse 21, we read this. That when Enoch had lived 65 years, he became the father of Methuselah. And after he became the father of Methuselah, Enoch walked with God for 300 years, and he had other sons and daughters. And altogether, Enoch lived a total of 365 years. Enoch walked faithfully with God. Then he was no more, because God took him away. Well, folks, what have we got here before all of us this morning? We have the story of one man who perhaps is the least known of all of the heroes who are here for us in this chapter. He's not in the same league as Moses and Abraham and Isaac and others. And so in terms of the famous names, he is right down the food chain. I think as all of us hear that, we just need to acknowledge right out the gate at the start of this study, as we think of this snapshot who clearly is as ordinary as all of us here, that no one in this room now has any right to be saying that this guy doesn't get how it feels to be me. The way that we might feel, for instance, with the Peters of the Bible and the Pauls in the Bible, and David and Samson and Daniel and even Noah, who clearly is the next in the line here in Hebrews. For all of their lives are really great in the Scriptures, and often we just feel it when we come to our Bibles that they have the wow factor, and we love all of their stories and look at their names up in lights and so on, and well, there's me sitting away at the side, and they know not how it feels to be me, right? Not this guy. And I mention that to all of us this morning so that the story of this man, as it shortly is held up for all of us here, and the story of his faith as he lived in a way that was all for God and not for this world, though he was here in this world, but not living for this world. I mention his ordinariness so that all of us will say, God, Would you birth his faith in me? Though my life is mundane, and though my life is just full of all of the same old things, that means I hardly can distinguish one day from the next in my life, and yet here's your model in the Scriptures, and here is your friend. If this man was in here this morning before all of us, he stood up here at the front that he might speak to us all about life and ministry and all the great things that had happened over the course of his years and all the extraordinary things and all the miracles and just all of that stuff. Well, here's what it would be that we would hear from this man, that thousands of my days, well, they all were the same. And here's how I made it. With faith. We know nothing at all of his occupation, which is really interesting, isn't it? Given all the time that we invest in our jobs and all the pride that we have in our jobs. What's your name? Graham. What do you do? I'm the minister of Musselburgh Baptist Church. And how tempting it is to feel that, okay, here's my identity, and yet here is this summary of a whole life in the Scriptures. No mention of his job. It's just his faith. Was he tall? Did he have muscles? And what was the size of his waist and so on? I think lots of us here are crippled with anxiety over the state of our bodies. And just all that means, and again, that is the influence that comes from the world. Here we all are living life in a culture that wants to be saying, here's my identity. And yet listen to what it is that the Scriptures are saying. For who is God drawn to? Is it the beautiful? Is it the faithful? Well, I want to know what that means, don't you? And so here for all of us this morning are 5 lessons. I'm conscious of the clock, but we're going to pick them off one by one as we work through all of them as they come to us in Genesis and Hebrews. And they are here for the ordinary. They're here for the daily grind. They're here for this week. They're here for the routines and for all of the plodders. Let's receive this morning as God's food for our lives. Number 1. I want you to notice here as we think of the life of this normal, regular, fairly unknown worshiper who would not be thought of as great in this world. Notice, would you with me, this great lesson that he leaves. Faith equals walking with God. And that phrase, as you'll see, is not here in Hebrews. It is there in the section in Genesis 5, and yet clearly not in this same sense as all of us walked here, or how we might walk with friends, or after the service you walk to the car. That's a walk with others that we see. But as we have noted now so many times in this series, our God is spirit. And he went for a walk with a God who is unseen, and we really need to know what that means. Are you walking with God? And when it comes to the great summary that someone will do at the very end of your life, would it not be one of the greatest sentences that those coming behind might ever express as they pull together all of the strands of your life and as they mention your work and your hobbies and funny stories and so on, and then, my dad went out for a walk one day with God, and it lasted for years and for years. Is that you? You just think for a second over the course of the last 7 days of life and all you have watched and all you have done and all the ways that you've used this gift of time. No question that you're saved because you've been to the cross. So no one is questioning that you're going to heaven. And yet, would you say that you walk with him now? Listen, the great news of the Scriptures as we come to this story is that here is this wonderful experience that is held out to you. You can have all of this. You can walk with him. And so let me explain to you what it is that this means, though there are all kinds of things I think we could be mentioning at this point. But let me mention 5 really simple things that I think will prove to keep all of us on track. Walking with God will at least mean progress. And so a sense of our fallenness, a sense of our shared imperfections, a sense of the struggles that are part and parcel of every single one of our lives here as Christians, and even all of the struggles that were all there in Enoch, they burst into the picture at this point. And so you hear me when I tell you that walking with God is not some kind of euphemism for no flaws. He's got no sins, no spiritual seasons that are filled with his shame, no spiritual seasons that are marked with his coldness. If that were the case, well, then we don't walk with God, and not even the best of us in this room. Not you, not the elders, and I can tell you, definitely not me. And so if you're here this morning and you've made one almighty hash of the last 7 days of your life, and you feel there's no hope that someone like you could ever walk with God, well then please be reminded of this great picture of progress. Walking is leaving, isn't it? You get on your shoes and you leave A for B. And so walking is traveling. Walking is a process that is long in its length. Miles are involved, there are bends and hills and twists in the road, and sitting at halfway, you have still to arrive, but you've come a long way, right? Far from A, but not yet at B. Not yet who you will be, but not close to who you were. Though miles from the end, you're now miles from the start. And right here in the middle, there are still flaws. And there are still sins. And yet, how far you have come. And God has brought change. Be encouraged. Walk on with God. But remember, there is still much more to leave. And you know, some of us this morning, we will be thinking to ourselves that grace is like our spiritual Nikes. And with grace in our feet, well, we can just always walk on, even with the sins that we just never will leave. And yet, do you not see that to walk with this God, there is always the sense of Christian progression? And so all the time in the journey, it's for Him. God, what do you want me to leave? God, what must I forsake? I want to walk with the Lord with all of my heart and give Him my all and not just a part. And so, look at how far I have come to this point, but God, what do you want me now to leave? And that's faith. Not living for this world, but living for God. Not thinking of the joy in sin, but the joy that's in Him. And so progression, number one. What about this thought? Think of persistence, which I just lift from the story that's there for us in Genesis. And honestly, my mind is simply boggling at this point. Next summer, I'm 50. I can tell you it's all starting to feel that it's all going south, and there are aches and pains and weight gain and so on. I play football on Thursdays, and then honestly, it's a struggle to climb the very stairs. That's the honest truth. And so here's a world that's really alien for you and me. They were going for hundreds of years. More than likely so that under God they could populate the world. Maybe they were healthier because they were closer to Eden. And yet that's not the issue that concerns us really this morning. It's just that he walked with God for 300 years. When he was feeling the urge, Sundays, when he couldn't be bothered, when he had the spiritual fuzzies, and then in the times when he had flatlined and it was really hard, and yet onwards he would say, and I'm sure he spoke to himself. And so here is a lesson that is so simple, but this is really huge. The life of faith is long. Unless your name is the thief on the cross, right? And the great danger for many of us is that we just go up like rockets, conversion, I love the church, preaching and so on. We're off like rockets, but we come down like rocks. And there is no persistence. There's no endurance. There's no perseverance. How sad it has been for many of us to have seen this, where so-and-so here, he really loves all of the singing and the preaching and all of these things. It just seems to the whole place that here's a guy and he walks with God. And then 3 weeks on, 3 months on, you look out here one Sunday and his seat is empty. This happens. Where have they gone? They're away. They've left. They're forsaken their first love. And so let's listen to what it is that God is saying to us at this point. Doggedness, grittiness, even a sheer, stubborn perseverance of the saints is right in the middle of faith. And your emotions will rise and your emotions will fall. You will have great weeks, and then the howlers will burst like storms right over your life. And yet here's a man who whispers to you, go on. Go on. When the excitement's there, you're lifting your hands in worship to God. And then in the times when the years are passing and there is nothing of note happening at all in your life. And here's a man who whispers to you, go on. You head off to uni. No more mum and dad. And suddenly the world is saying that you don't need this stuff. But here's a man who whispers to you, go on. Keep traveling onwards with faith. Progress, persistence. What about this word? We have purity. For clearly it would be so different if we were reading this morning that for 300 years God was walking with Enoch. Which, of course, is true. This is a God who is right there at our side. He's behind and before, as it says in the Psalms. And yet this is not God going in the back seat of his car. And then going where he went and doing what he did and watching what he watched. And that's not what this is. And so understand then that when you walk with God, and that is to speak of intimacy and communion and nearness to God. And so understand then that to have that in your life, it's all going to fundamentally change. I'm going to say it, brothers, and I don't want to crush you, but I want to encourage you so that you are motivated to go on with God and to go on to new heights in your walk with God. And so, brothers, hear this. Pornography is pervasive. It is here in the church. It is here with men. And that is something that you need to leave. Or then maybe in your life it's a sin of anger. People are needing, as it were, to tiptoe around you, and that is another sin that you need to leave. And then when it's not left, and there are days of sin, you come to say sorry, and, oh God, make me pure again. And that is the life of faith. It says Spurgeon at this point, and this is great, he says to us, not one single Christian ever in history has simultaneously possessed these two experiences, intimacy with God and intimacy with his sin. And so there is progression, there is persistence, there has to be purity. And then what about this thought? Surely it brings to us, doesn't it, peace? As you stand in the crisis point, and yet this God is there, and you feel it inside, and it's so tangible. His peace. You're leaving your home maybe for the first time as a student, and yet this you can say that I have got God. And you feel it inside, and it's tangible. There's a peace. To be known by Him, to be loved by Him, to feel His forgiveness and all of His grace, and live every single day of your life in the knowledge that all of God, so this is all of God. All of God is with me. Which explains, of course, why it would be so fitting at this point if we put in this fifth word, and this would have to be, wouldn't it, pleasure. Because listen to what it is that David once said. He said, "At your right hand, God, there are pleasures forever," which we know are the things that we will all find in heaven when we have exited down here and we've made it back home. And yet think of the Christian who walks with Him now. Don't you think he'll get these pleasures here? The enjoyment of God, the smile, the friendship, the love of this God, and just to know that He is right here with me. Faith equals walking with God. Number 2, notice, faith thrives in the midst of weakness. Which I take from this story in Genesis 5. And the last thing I'm wanting to be doing at this point is bending the Scriptures and, as it were, squeezing the Scriptures and making them say something that just was never intended. And yet, look at your Bibles at verse 22 and let us ask this question. Well, when did he walk with God? And the answer is when he became a dad. And he was age 65. And there was little Methuselah sitting right there in his arms. And I guess all of the parents this morning, we will have been in these shoes. And what a life change. And he knows he will influence. He knows that but for God, he's going to make a mess of all of the years that are lying ahead. And something of his weakness, it just stirs in his heart. Is that you? I haven't spoken about this before, but the first day that we fostered, oh my, God, I can't do this. God, this is too hard for me. And maybe there are many of us sitting in here this morning as we think now of our families and as we think now of our home and then just any struggle, all of the burdens that we're carrying in life, of which no one in this room is going to have the first clue. And isn't it so true that we don't like weakness? But we should see here it drove this man to God. His weakness is what led him to God. His insecurities, it seems, is what led him to God. Much the same, of course, we could say is the life of Jonah when he went for a cruise. Picture him there on the high seas. And up there on that deck, well, I don't need God. And that is the way, isn't it, in all of our lives? Life is fine, all's well, health is tremendous. We even have savings in the bank. And so God has to use things like fish and like waves. And then in his weakness, he just runs to his God. And so listen, here's another lesson for all of us this morning. There are no strong Christians in the kingdom of God. Not even here in this church. No difference between me and you and all of us here in this room. And so whether it be when a child is born, fostered, adopted into your family, or whether it be when your health hit the wall, or grief has come to you, or there's some kind of weakness, or you are wrestling all the time with all your addictions, you must listen to Enoch. God, I'm so weak. And do you know what that is? That's faith. God, I am running to you because it is you that I need. And do you know what that is? It's faith. Because faith equals walking with God. It thrives in the midst of weakness. 3, and crucially, clearly in this unfolding story, faith remembers the coming judgment. Which brings us, of course, back into the story in Genesis where Adam and Eve had blown it, and we know that. And so sin is now here. Cain kills his brother. Think of it. The world's first baby became the world's first murderer. And Enoch is living right here in these times. We are even told when we have made it right on through to the days of Noah that the world was so wicked and it's all gone south, and actually all of the thoughts of mankind were evil. And then it adds these words. It says, all of the time. And so I want to just pause here and remind all of us this morning as we think of our schools, as we think of Trinent, we think of the Pans and here in Musselburgh, as we think of our offices, and then even in our families where many will be saying, listen, we don't need God. I want to remind all of us this morning that even in that kind of world, which was Enoch's world, and it is our world, it is possible to walk with God. Now, I want to argue at this point that it seems there is no doubt that Enoch was crystal clear that in the course of history, this cataclysmic judgment of God would simply drop down on our world. He tells us in Jude, that text is there on the screens, then maybe even a hint in the name of his son. For do you know what it is that Methuselah means? It means when he is dead, it is going to be sent. Which, would you believe, was precisely the way that it was when it came to the lifespan of his son in this story. For when he was dead, in that very year it was sent. And that, of course, is the flood. And you can do all of the maths, and you can get all of the numbers, and right there in the same year as the death of this boy, it came on our world, and it seems that he knew. And so here's a man who was clear on the judgment, and it drove him in his life to give his all to God. And here's the issue. What about you? It is appointed unto man once to die. And then after that, what does he say? It's the judgment. And so if Enoch was here speaking to all of us this morning, I think he would be saying to us something along these kinds of lines, that this God had warned me, and now he has warned you. And so here's what is needed. It's faith. Oh, the years were passing. It seemed it would never come, but God had warned me, and now he has warned you. And now here's what you need. It's faith. And so faith equals walking with God. It thrives in the midst of weakness. It remembers the coming judgment. Number 4, just very simply from last Sunday morning, faith receives a true assurance, which is maybe where it is that, again, we're all wrestling this morning. Am I really a Christian? Am I going to heaven? Am I truly forgiven? Am I sure I am saved? And where am I at with God? And so on. And often for Christians, it's this struggle for years. And yet here is this wonderful truth that is here. Just listen to what it is that the Scriptures are saying. To a guy who didn't go to the jungle with the gospel, to a guy who was never in membership in church, to a guy who has read no books, to a guy who has no Bible, and to a guy who has never been baptized. This is that guy. And look at this line in verse 5. You please me. We all learned from last week in the story of Abel that he came to the altar, he put there a substitute as an offering for sins. God, this is for me, this is for all of my past, it's for all my mistakes, for all of the times that I have wandered and I have strayed. And so do you not see what this is saying for Christians? It's for all your addictions. It's for all of your past, for all of the times when you've wandered and when you've strayed. And yet we came to the cross and we still have got doubts. Am I really a Christian? Am I going to heaven? Am I truly forgiven? Am I really saved? But God says to the faithful, you're the ones who please me. Faith receives a true assurance. And then in the last instance, as we land the plane, I want you to notice here, as we think of this story, that it is faith that delivers us out of this world. Which, of course, is the whole of the story of Enoch, as he lived in a world that was shrouded in death, and there were always funerals, there was always loss, people were dying left and right, even Adam. And yet here was this man with whom God was so pleased that he leaned out of heaven and he just took him home. And maybe we are here and we're kind of saying to ourselves, that's a great story, Graham. Great story from the past. What a reward and a great experience for him. What a great ending for a man who was so faithful, and yet, well, what has this all got to do now with me? I just came here this morning, Graham, with all sorts of hard things going on in my life, and there are all of these stresses and things that I wish were not part of my story. And many of us this morning, we are right in that place. And in some there is no faith. In some of us there is cold faith. And yet look at this wonderful word that's here in verse 6. Not just for Enoch, but for anyone. This is for you. We are told to believe. We're to believe in God. We are told to seek Him. So no room for passivity, but you will seek me and you will find me when you seek me, says God, with all of your heart. And some of us this morning, we are not in that place. And we're just gliding along. We're still in sins. We're waiting for something, some light to switch on. And yet, He rewards those who earnestly seek Him. With forgiveness, with the privilege of then walking with God. And then one day, just like Enoch, He will reach down from heaven. And you will find He will take you straight home. So folks, your company matters. Here's a great friend. Wouldn't it be great if someone said of you one day, by faith, and then your name, walked with God.